Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about theories of alibi behavior. Now, before we even get into this, you guys should have watched the documentary The Long Shot on Netflix. And if you haven't, I'll give you a very quick review, but I recommend you stop this and go watch that because it's a very interesting documentary that's very important for this lecture. So, Juan Catalan was accused of murdering a witness, 16-year-old Martha Pueblo, who testified against his brother in a criminal trial. When Juan Catalan was approached about this, he remembered he was at a Dodgers game at the time of the crime and provided his ticket stub. So he had some evidence, right? Although it was not necessarily the strongest physical evidence, he had some evidence that he was at the game with his ticket stub. He needed a uniquely dedicated attorney to get him out of it and to get the charges dropped. And this documentary goes through the process of the tremendous work his attorney did, which was really some very, very great lawyer's work, and his attorney should be commended for being so dedicated to that work. Prosecutors and police were unwilling to admit they were wrong, and the entirety of the whole case was based on a single eyewitness. So here are some questions for you to think about after watching that documentary on Netflix, and some things that we're going to really bring up today throughout this lecture. So, for a theory of alibi generation, if you really think about it, the task of an accused person who truly believes that they're innocent is, and who really is innocent, is to, number one, accurately remember where they were for a potentially normal event, provide verifiable evidence, which the suspect doesn't know is important, right? For example, do we routinely keep our receipts? Are we routinely every day coming up with evidence for what we did that day to try and support ourselves? And then to convince the evaluators that the evidence and therefore the alibi claim is true, right? The evaluators are already believing, if they're accusing you of a crime, that you're guilty, and so you have to somehow overcome that presumption of guilt in order to convince them that this is in fact a true statement. So the problem with each of these steps are, number one, people often misremember where they are at a time that may be weeks, months, or years later or earlier. People may not have or fail to even realize they have corroborating evidence. I typically, and this very much upsets my wife, take my receipts and throw them on the kitchen counter, or I might throw them in my car cup holder, or we have a little area where we keep our keys and my wallet and stuff in the house. I throw receipts in there. I don't necessarily know the dates for all those receipts in there, so I might have corroborating evidence of where I was at that time. I just might not know I have it. Evaluators also tend to be highly skeptical of alibis, dismissive of the evidence produced, biased by factors that affect the strength of the alibi, and also poor at discriminating between true and false alibis and alibi claims. Therefore, evaluators have several problems in and of themselves also. The social scientific research has done a decent job of identifying the problem, right? We don't have a great solution, though. We've done a terrible job at identifying these solutions, right? And this is not because we're not trying, but how do we come up with a solution that gets you to remember something that you don't remember? We can't come up with a solution for that, right? How do we come up with a solution to get someone to believe that you're telling the truth when they don't believe that you're telling the truth? These are very, very difficult things to do. Therefore, Sharman et al. Advocated for a systems variable approach to alibi evidence that involves developing and testing interventions aimed at improving the quality of alibi evidence, right? And we'll talk about that here in a second. As a reminder, as a review from the eyewitness literature, estimator variables are those factors that are beyond the control of the criminal justice system, and the reliability of an eyewitness can only be estimated, right? Hence, estimator. We only estimate what these variables are. Systems variables, which is what Sharman is advocating for, are factors that are under the control of the criminal justice system, right? And that's an important distinction. So Sharman is saying, let's look at the variables we can control and see if, by controlling those variables, we actually can improve alibis. So when developing a theory, what factors are important to social scientists? Generally, when social scientists are trying to come up with a theoretical idea, they have to define what the problem is and propose solutions to those problems. Those are the two things that they're trying to kind of do. However, there are some pitfalls we will discuss that can be problematic in theory development, right? And if you think about it, and these social scientific theories range a whole host of things, right? They could be theories of personality, they could be theories of crime and criminal behavior, right? And in a very basic level, right, you hear people say stuff and they throw out theories all the time. Well, crime is a problem. The best way to solve that problem? Lock up all the criminals. That's a theory, right? If we lock up the criminals, crime will go down. What's the problem? Crime. What's the solution? Lock them all up, right? And that's a very basic, kind of simplistic example of a theory, but that's kind of what social scientists do and all theorists do in all fields, is identifying the problem and proposing solutions. So Sharman et al. Suggest a tripartite classification of alibi-providing suspects, right? Most of legal psychology divides people into a binary, right? There's two groups. You're either a correct eyewitness or a mistaken eyewitness. You're either lying or telling the truth. You're either confessing to a crime you committed or it's a false confession of a crime you didn't commit. Alibis aren't that simple, right? The concern is not just correct or incorrect. It's also honest versus dishonest. And so you see with these above examples, right, we have correct or mistaken. We have liars or truth tellers. With alibis down here, it's correct and mistaken, albeit alibis, as well as lying and truth-telling. And so it's a much more complicated problem. Therefore, there are three categories of witnesses. There are deceptive witnesses that are probably guilty, right? They're just lying and probably did it. There's honest and accurate, which are innocent suspects who provide an accurate alibi. And then there's honest mistaken, innocent suspects who provide an inaccurate alibi, right? And so there's three categories of witnesses that are present, and we have to try and decipher all of these. Are they telling the truth? And if they're telling the truth, are they actually accurate or not? This tripartite classification makes developing interventions also more complicated, because we're not just determining lying from truth-telling, we're also determining accurate from inaccurate. And the problem is, inaccurate can look a whole lot like deceptive. And so that's where it also becomes even more complicated. So consider the following interventions. Law enforcement officers allowed suspects to discuss their whereabouts with family and friends. If we did this, right, if we said, hey, we think you committed this crime, go home, talk to your friends, talk to your family, develop an alibi for me. This would allow honest suspects to move from the inaccurate to the accurate category with a whole lot more evidence, right? However, it would also allow deceptive suspects to convince friends to help them lie and gather evidence that they were innocent. Therefore, it would decrease the diagnosticity of the alibi evaluation based on veracity, right? So if we told everyone, go home, collect as much evidence as you need, and come back, sure, that would help the honest people, that would help the innocent people, but it would also help the deceptive people. And we don't want to help both groups. We want to figure out a way to help the honest people without helping the deceitful people, right? However, shifting from a mistaken versus accurate evaluation to an honest, dishonest evaluation is also problematic, right? And so the first one, it was, let's try and figure out accurate versus inaccurate. This one is, well, let's try and figure out honest versus dishonest. Consider this intervention. Law enforcement officers adopt a strategic use of evidence approach to alibi accuracy. And just for those of you who don't know, strategic use of evidence is a strategy of interrogation that involves using inconsistencies between a suspect's story and the case evidence as a proxy for deception. So basically, I might ask somebody, where they were at 10 a.m. and they say they were out at a bar drinking, and I don't tell them that I actually have security footage of them at 10:15 across town. I then present them with that 10:15 evidence. Say, well, how could you be at that bar drinking at 10 and then be across town 15 minutes later on the security camera footage? And then all of a sudden I've caught them in some sort of possible deception. This allows alibi evaluators to determine between honest and dishonest alibi statements. But mistaken and dishonest alibis are classified the same way in this system. If you're like, oh, yeah, you're right. Thank you for showing me that security camera footage. Now I remember I was out at the bar Thursday night. We're talking about Friday night. Yes, I was over here. Well, no, you just look like you're lying and you just look like you're dishonest in this kind of system. Therefore, the task of the researcher is to move all of the honest suspects into the honest, accurate condition while simultaneously differentiating between the honest and deceitful suspects. Obviously, as you've already started to deduce throughout this lecture, this is a very, very complicated process. Sharman and Shambaugh suggest that this complex design requires a multi-pronged approach with three main strategies. And we're going to talk about all these strategies in detail here. But the first strategy is to transfer an honest mistaken into an honest accurate suspect. So the first thing we need to do is get everyone into the honest accurate condition that's actually honest. We're ignoring the deceitful ones right now. Get everyone into the honest accurate condition. All right, so that way we can eliminate honest mistaken, and we're only comparing liars versus truth tellers. Then improve the honest accurate suspect's ability to produce corroborating evidence. All right, and then improve the evaluator's abilities to discriminate between liars and truth tellers. So we get people in the honest accurate condition, help the honest accurate people produce evidence, and then figure out ways to discriminate between liars and truth tellers at that point. So strategy one, right? First, it's important to understand why innocent suspects generate mistaken alibis. We've already talked about this in alibi generation. You can go back and look at that lecture if you don't quite remember about alibi generation. Mainly, the reliance on schemas when they can't remember the specifics of a certain time or day is why people produce inaccurate alibis. So, what if we asked suspects to not do this? What if we said, don't rely on your schemas, right? Rely on your memory for that event. Think about July 17th, right? What were you doing the 16th? What were you doing the 15th? What day of the week is it? What things are happening? This is after the 4th of July, right? And so we can start trying to do something called the schema disconfirmation model. Don't rely on your schema. Don't make this a logic problem. Make this a memory thing. What usually happens on that third week of July? What were you doing? Do you have things going on in your life on that third week of July, right? It's possibly after a payday. So do you behave differently after paydays? Think about all these things that are not schemas to disconfirm that model. Researchers believe that telling suspects not to rely on schemas would be effective at generating accurate alibis. Unfortunately, this didn't necessarily work because schemas are based on actual memories, right? In other words, the suspects are relying on memories, just inaccurate memories, right? And so the idea here is kind of like in the examples I gave you before. Even if I said like the 17th, it's after a payday. Well, that's still what on my schema am I doing after a payday, right? It's the 17th. That was a Thursday. It's the third week of the month. What are you typically doing on the third week of the month, right? That's still a schema, right? So simply instructing people to ignore their schemas is missing an important facet of accurate alibi generation. It doesn't tell people how to access that missing memory, right? So because of that, since these instructions don't work, Cardenas et al. Suggested that suspects should visualize their physical and psychological environment at the time in question, which is referred to as the mental restatement of context. So instead of just schema disconfirmation, it's let's mentally restate the context here. This is a key element of the cognitive interview and allows for more possible cues to remind a suspect where they were. Of course, unfortunately, this didn't work either because the mental restatement of context requires you to accurately remember where you were in the first place. If I said to you, close your eyes and picture where you were on the 17th, you were probably in your office. What do you typically do on a Tuesday in your office? Think about that. Work through that. How did you feel that Tuesday? Well, how in the world do I supposed to know how I feel that Tuesday if I don't remember that Tuesday? I have to remember where I was to actually remember how I felt, to remember what I was doing, to actually mentally restate this context, right? So since schemas are used, suspects should actively try to disconfirm their schema before reporting their memory to the police. And so what Sharman and Shambaugh suggest is, well, we know people are going to use their schemas. Actively try to disconfirm your schema instead. Allow a suspect to use their phone, the calendar, their diary to disprove their schema, right? Now remember, this may also help false alibis to be generated, right? Of course, this might help deceptive folks. However, researchers believe that this will disproportionately help innocent versus guilty suspects because guilty suspects don't actually have any real evidence to find because they're guilty, right? So look in your phone, look in your calendar, look in your diary. Were you doing something differently that day? Perhaps most Tuesdays at 10 a.m., you're sitting in your office doing work, but then you look at your calendar and realize, oh, that's right, we had that long lunch meeting that Tuesday. And so I had to leave early to get to that long lunch meeting. And so that all of a sudden allows me to remember and disconfirm what I typically do on a certain day. Preliminary research suggests that allowing suspects access to their phones increases accurate alibis by about 3 times. However, it also did help inaccurate alibis be more believable. The question, though, is that 3x improvement in accurate alibis large enough to discount the smaller increase in inaccurate believability? So strategy 2 helps improve honest, accurate suspects' abilities to produce corroborating evidence. So moving from honest to mistaken to honest, accurate is important, but it's not enough to solve the alibi problem, right? So sure, you're honest and you remember accurately where you were, but you need corroborating evidence, right? Even highly accurate alibis will still be viewed with suspicion if they don't have that corroboration. Therefore, the second strategy is to help honest, accurate suspects, who we've moved presumably all the honest people into an ability to collect strong corroborating evidence. So there's 2 general strategies to find corroborating person evidence, okay? One is to improve the suspect's memory for people with whom they interacted with, right? And a cognitive interview may help with this, although it's never been tested in an alibi setting. However, there are some serious caveats to this strategy because it might also help deceitful alibis too by doing some sort of cognitive interview, and that cognitive interview may also just reveal that you were with motivated familiar others, and we know that in some conditions, motivated familiar others are actually worse than having no corroboration. The other one is to improve the potential corroborator's memories for the event, right? For the accused, the suspect. Improve the potential corroborator's memories for the suspect present. So, studies of this practice have had somewhat disappointing results, but the basic idea here is if you say you were with your mother, bring your mom in and let's try and improve her memory of being with you at that certain time, or a stranger's memory of being with you at that certain time. More research needs to be done here to see if this is a viable solution, because this practice, like I said, has had somewhat disappointing results. To improve the quality of physical evidence, there's only one study to date that has attempted to improve this by asking suspects to recall more types of evidence. They asked participants to go through their alibi story chronologically to identify the evidence. And then they said, take someone else's perspective who was with you to try and identify evidence, right? Both strategies increase the number of items they could remember as physical evidence. And so if I were to say to you, where were you at the time? Okay, well, I know that my coworker and I went to lunch at 10 a.m., or 10 a.m. is not lunchtime. On July 17th at noon, my coworker and I went to lunch. We went to, McDonald's right around the corner, and that's that. Okay, that's great. Now you remember that. Take your friend's perspective, or your coworker's perspective. What would they remember from that lunch? Oh my goodness, you know what? I forgot. We went through an ATM that day. They might have a receipt from that. There might be video camera footage of me sitting in my friend's car at lunch during that time. From their perspective, they also called their wife, and I said hi to their wife on the phone from the car, so maybe we could call her in. And so by doing this, all of a sudden you start to see where you could increase the number of pieces of evidence that are present. Of course, the caveat to this is it still relies on a suspect remembering where they were for the evidence to actually exist. You have to actually remember the perspective of the other person as well as yourself accurately to be able to do this step. Strategy 3 is improving evaluators' abilities to discriminate between liars and truth tellers. Unfortunately, the other 2 strategies will mean nothing if an honest suspect is actually mistaken or has no corroboration, right? Therefore, investigators need to distinguish between liars and truth tellers, and this actually needs to take place at various stages of a criminal investigation. The police need to think that you're telling the truth or lying, then prosecutors, then judges, then juries, right? In order for you to get believed or convicted. This means you might have to try hard to convince a bunch of different groups and a bunch of different courtroom actors and legal system actors about your innocence. So people are generally poor at discriminating between liars and truth tellers, despite what people tell you. I can always spot a liar. No, they can't. They look for cues that are not diagnostic of actual deception, right? Looking up and to the right, sweat, dry eyes or mouth, fidgeting. All of these things are not particularly diagnostic of lying versus truth-telling. And so if people are poor, right, at detecting this, what do? Well, first of all, we know that in alibis, inconsistency is viewed as deception. So researchers have shifted their focus from this physiological deception to a more cognitive approach. Let's stop trying to look for these exterior signs of detection and actually do a more in-depth cognitive approach to this. This is based on the idea that liars are under increased cognitive load than truth tellers and therefore have a more difficult time keeping the lie up with increased cognitive demand. It actually is somewhat difficult to lie because you have to make sure your lie is internally consistent, right? You have to make sure that your lie is plausible. You have to make sure that the person who you're lying to believes the lie. And so if we increase the cognitive load, it makes it more difficult to lie because lying has increased cognitive demand. However, testing this idea did not help differentiate between liars and truth tellers in an alibi context, right? So when lie detection is weak, a dishonest suspect who brings a dishonest corroborator opens the door for more opportunities, right? So, I can't tell if you're lying or not, but you say you were with your brother? Go ahead and bring your brother in too. I'm going to talk to both of you, all right? And then there's two strategies here. Consistency between the suspect and corroborator stories, right? This may help liars as they prepare their story ahead of time versus truth tellers who rely on their own memories, which are prone to errors, right? But still, the idea here is bring your brother in, separate him from the suspect, and then find out, are they both telling me the same version of events or not? If there are heavy inconsistencies here, this might be evidence of lying. Of course, liars might have practiced their story once or twice before they came into the police station. The other strategy is a verifiability approach, right? Guilty suspects actually have a conflict. They want to provide a detailed alibi, but the greater the detail, the easier to find flaws that prove you're lying. So what do you do here, right? If you're a guilty suspect, I need to give you enough information that you believe me, but not so much that if you poke around and look at it, you'll be able to find out. Innocent suspects, on the other hand, want their alibi investigated to prove their innocence. So they say, open up the door. You have access to everything because I'm innocent, right? Therefore, the content of the alibi will probably differ between liars and truth tellers. Liars are going to say things like, okay, I need to give you a tremendous amount of detail. I was watching a movie at home. What movie were you watching? The movie I was watching was, what's a common movie that everyone's seen? Home Alone, around Christmas time. I was watching Home Alone, where Kevin McAllister is left home by his parents and the bad guys try and break in the house and he rigs up the house and beats the bad guys. Okay, well, how can I verify that? How can I prove that you were doing that? I mean, Home Alone airs like every night of the week during the holiday season. I can't really prove that or falsify that. So what can I do with that? Not much. That, for a guilty suspect, is like the perfect evidence in his mind because he's now given you something that you can't really verify but seems very believable. Innocent suspects tend to provide alibis where there is actually investigations. I was at Walmart. Go pull the Walmart security footage. I look at red light cameras. Here's the route between my house and Walmart. And they give you a lot of evidence that suggests that you can verify what it is that they were doing. Researchers accurately differentiated 88% of alibi-providing pairs using this verifiability approach. Using the evidence where they said, go check me out, go fact check me, I'm telling you the truth, was a good way to determine and look between liars and truth tellers. So discriminating between honest and deceptive suspects, the verifiability approach is the most promising method to distinguish between these, but it still does have limitations. The approach is limited only to suspects who have a corroborator, right? You need someone with you in order to have that verifiability. Since most evaluators believe inconsistency is indicative of guilt, will police allow corroborators and suspects actual time to talk to get their story straight? The police might not even like this idea, even though it's a fairly strong method. It also assumes that truth tellers actually have verifiable information to share, which means if they don't, truth tellers may still be viewed as guilty. What if the truth is actually you were sitting at home during Christmas time watching Home Alone? Well, now suddenly you might look guilty because you don't have anything to verify that, right? And so that's another problem with this approach. All of this taken together is just to say that to develop theories of alibi corroboration and ways to improve alibi corroboration is a very taxing element in alibi corroboration research and in social scientific studies in general. This is the first step by Steve Sharman down at FIU to actually come up with the theoretical concept and constructs behind alibi corroboration, but clearly more work here needs to be done. As always, if you guys have any questions, please drop a comment down below or feel free to reach out to me via email, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon.